AAA publishers, stop forcing your single-player studios to make live service games. The games industry we have now is very different to the one it once was. 10 years ago, we had two different consoles in the Xbox One and PS4, both great systems that offered wildly different experiences on both the single-player and multiplayer side, whether that be the fast-paced close-quarters action of Halo 5 Guardians or the high-flying open-world spectacle of something like Marvel's Spider-Man. Arguably, one of the most influential games to release during the last console generation, however, is Destiny. And why is Bungie's shared world sci-fi shooter so influential, you ask? Well, for the simple fact that now, even a decade later since release, everything wants to be Destiny still. And I would argue that we as players continue to suffer from the consequences. Now, before we begin, disclaimer, I put 150 hours into the original Destiny. I laid waste to countless legions of Cabal and killed that Archon priest back on Venus maybe half a dozen times, if not more. But then something happened. Instead of carrying on and playing 150 more hours of Destiny, I went on, I left, and tried new things. Today, that isn't enough for certain AAA publishers. The likes of EA, Ubisoft, Microsoft, and now even PlayStation are determined to find ways to suck up all of players' time through a relatively new genre called the live service game, a type of game that Destiny is largely accredited with coining, at least in the console space. Now, live service games are different to traditional single-player games, and even some multiplayer games, because of the amount of time and energy that's demanded from both the player and developer side. And the result is that neither side is ever really satisfied. You either have players happy with a boatload of content, very much to the detriment of developer burnout and potentially crunch, or you have developers with a relatively decent work-life balance, but very much to the detriment of players always being hungry for more and more content. In order to try and achieve that balance that both sides are in search of, something strange started to happen a while ago, and arguably hasn't stopped happening. Previously prestigious single-player focused developers suddenly were forced to U-turn to work on multiplayer-centric games in order to try and find and hunt down that live service game success, in search of the money. The earliest example I can recall where this happened was back in 2017, with the reveal of Anthem, an online-centric multiplayer game that allowed players to pilot flying exosuits known as javelins. The gameplay loop was very Destiny-like in nature, with players squadding up to complete missions and engaging in thrilling PvE. It looked and mostly felt good to play, but it very quickly became apparent that Anthem didn't have the level of content required to sustain a fervent player base. Its publisher, EA, clearly had high hopes that they'd have a similar hit to Activision's at the time, but after careful consideration, all future development ceased for it in 2021, just 2 years after it initially launched. Promises went unfulfilled, potential went untapped, and the endeavour for its studio can be chalked up as largely a waste of time and a waste of resources. I say this because Anthem's developer, BioWare, used to be lauded for its amazing single-player RPGs. Baldur's Gate, Knights of the Old Republic, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, the list goes on. Instead of creating meaningful relationships with characters, a well-thought-through story, and an interesting world that players would want to engage in at their own pace, as they had done before, Anthem ended up as little more than a big, standard sci-fi shooter without any identity of its own. This was a single-player studio largely forced to chase the live service trend rather than lean into its own expertise. And while BioWare is still around, Dragon Age Dreadwolf still seems a ways off, and so much time has been wasted since its last single-player game in 2014. Obviously, the story of Anthem didn't happen in a vacuum, and the case of Square Enix's Marvel's Avengers is very much the same. Its developer, Crystal Dynamics, previously built up a great reputation as the custodian of the Tomb Raider series. Suddenly, after being handed the crown jewel of Marvel's superhero IP though, the remit was not to create a focused single-player campaign centered on Earth's mightiest heroes, but to stuff it full of cosmetics, microtransactions, and grindy side missions that ended up leaving most players feeling unfulfilled. The idea behind making an Avengers game co-op was sound, because who wouldn't want to fight side by side alongside friends as iconic characters like Iron Man, Captain America and Black Widow? The problem was, getting Crystal Dynamics to make it felt like forcing a Square Enix peg into a round hole, resulting in constantly delayed content and expansions which, surprise surprise, saw support ended just after 3 years. And that's a lot within the realm of live service game failures. If you thought AAA publishers had learned from these failings, think again. Because already 2023 has made a bad case for live service games being worked on by studios that are historically single player centric. Redfall, although not explicitly stuffed full of microtransactions, apparently started out that way, according to a Bloomberg report from Jason Schreier, and no amount of bland gunplay could hide what very blatantly started out life as a live service title. Because that's the problem with game development, it's a very slow ship to turn around. You can't simply pivot when people have already invested multiple years worth of money and developers' time when you suddenly start to see the outlook on live service games souring. For better and worse, it's much better to release a game half finished or incomplete than simply bin it, hence Redfall. Whereas Arcane Austin had perfected the art of giving players an intimate space to explore and investigate, suddenly they were tasked with creating an entire town, 2 whole maps, and filling it with lots of interesting things for player to do. It was an impossible task for this team almost from the off. And believe it or not, we're still in the midst of another such pivot, in the form of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. A particularly sore topic for me, given just how much I enjoyed Rocksteady's original Arkham trilogy. Woes with the Batmobile aside, these were the games that single-handedly caused people to rethink their stance on licensed games. Batman games that were actually good seemed impossible, but Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, and Arkham Knight were so much better than that, truly letting you roleplay as the Dark Knight with wildly detailed locations to explore, a legendary rogues gallery to fight, and cool gadgets to deploy out in the world and during combat. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, by comparison, at least from what we've seen so far, looks to very much not be that. Its showing during the April PlayStation Showcase demonstrated a far cry from the story-centric exploration and detective investigation of old, in favour of what looks to be a rather ho-hum, co-op PvE title where Harley Quinn, Captain Boomerang, King Shark and Deadshot must shoot the glowy purple thing on enemies. Now, this might turn out to be tons of fun, but to think that we got this over a true Batman Arkham Knight successor, it breaks my heart. Warner Bros. Games and Rocksteady clearly feel similarly too, delaying the game countless times to try and salvage what very little fun seems to be present in this very flawed, multiplayer, live service-centric foundation. However, much like Redfall, Marvel's Avengers, Anthem, and countless other examples before it, I think the writing for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League has been on the wall for a while, and the last Batman game from Warner Bros. Last year, Gotham Knights, doesn't give me a lot of confidence either. Asking a historically single-player studio to U-turn into making a live service game simply doesn't work. Not only because in the majority of cases the final game is an underbaked cacophony of ideas with no ability to keep players engaged for anywhere near long enough, because it robs people of the utterly excellent single-player, story-driven games that they probably could have made in that time if their efforts weren't focused elsewhere. Gaming is ultimately a business, and a business needs to make money. I understand that. But when I hand over my £60 for a AAA game, live service or otherwise, I expect it to function as intended and live up to the promise that publishers have made, even if it's not necessarily my cup of tea. When publishers put out a live service game, they are making a promise to the player that it will continue to be supported for years to come. But it's one that they seem to keep failing on, either because the project was doomed from the off, or because it turns out to be a much bigger endeavour than what publishers realised or the chosen developer is capable of. So hear me out, AAA publishers. Stop forcing your single-player developers to make live service games. Anyway, I'm off to go play some more Redfall.